When I was in my early 20s, I moved to a rural area in Kansas in the fall of 2009. I worked as a freelance writer and made some good money for someone living in the country. The countryside was nice, although a bit lonely, as I lived alone without anyone to visit or talk to. It was sad, but I usually ended up enjoying myself with the peace and quiet. One day, I had a day off from work and decided to dedicate that time to myself. At one point during the day, I take my dog Baxter out for a walk near the trail I lived by to just get that autumn breeze while watching the orangish-yellow leaves fall to the ground. We go down this really popular hiking trail that I always go on, and for whatever reason, I decided to take my dog with me for the first time. For the most part, Baxter seemed to be stable while walking along the trail with me. I saw it as a good way for me to earn his trust, as I had adopted him from a family that was somewhat abusive. We continue going down this path when I spot another hidden path within this one that I've never been on. It was a little small, with some dense brush, but it looked nice, and so I decided to walk with Baxter along this new trail just to try it out. I remember walking past a few trees by this huge rock when I noticed Baxter looking up ahead. His ears are up, and his tail is slowly making those back and forth movements when a dog seems alert. Thinking that he could have smelled a mouse or a lizard, I playfully tell him to go get it and release him from the leash. Right then, I see him run towards some thicket when he comes to a stop and starts barking. However, the barks weren't those cute, curious ones, but rather sounded more defensive. For some reason, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, as I knew whatever he was barking at made him feel threatened in some way. I'd like to add that Baxter is a German Shepherd, very alert and protective when needed. I slowly approach him and carefully clip the leash back onto his harness and nudge him to follow me. Thankfully, he listens, and that's when I carefully look into the thicket to try and see what he was barking at. It was hard to see, but I could have sworn I saw what looked like a person crouched down by some thick brush. Not even a second later, I hear the sound of a really unpleasant laugh coming from them. I didn't even dream of confronting them or going up to them, fearing what they'd do to me if I did. All the while, Baxter was looking back, still barking at whoever that was, even when I tried to calm him down. We thankfully got back to the house safely, where I was sure I wasn't being followed. A few days later, I had gone into town for some coffee before work when I had read the local paper and saw a chilling news report. It turns out, a few weeks ago, there had been a couple hunters in the same area I lived nearby and had both been found dead in the woods. The town never revealed as to how they died, but they said the cause wasn't natural. Someone had did this on purpose. That story still bothers me till this day, knowing that there was someone in those woods who had managed to kill two hunters who obviously had to be armed with some type of weapon. I wasn't sure if it was just one person or several people, but I'm 99.9% convinced that they had to be linked to my encounter. I could be wrong, but I knew the chances of that were slim. It's been well over 10 years since that happened, and I haven't moved past it. Baxter unfortunately died of cancer 4 years later as we weren't able to catch it early. I was beyond devastated, but I knew life moved on. I haven't been back to that house since, but my grandparents have, as they use it for the holidays. But even after 10 years, nothing has happened since.
The story takes place in the fall of 2013 in the mountains of southern Oregon. I'm a military policeman. My girlfriend was at work, and as a hot day began to turn into some thunderstorms, my buddy Nick and I decided to go explore some back roads and just get out of the heat in town. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used and many totally forgotten and overgrown. Nick and I spent many of our days off, starting on roads that we knew, finding roads we didn't know, driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building up over the mountains, we set off on a road we'd never been on and began the drive into the mountains themselves. After driving for over an hour, we hadn't seen nor heard any signs of other people in the woods. We rounded a bend into thick fir woods and emerged into a meadow that was totally surrounded by thick aspen groves. The meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, hardly any insect noise, no squirrels, and certainly no other people. On the far side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. It was painted bright orange and was much larger than a typical picnic table in a park. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow just to get a closer look. I remember feeling apprehensive as we approached it. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the aspen grove was unsettling. Also, it was nearly impossible to see far into the trees, as aspens grow extremely close together. When we parked by the table, I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I myself am not very tall, only about 5'5". Regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning I would have to climb up to even sit on them. As I was looking at the table, Nick called me back over to the truck, and I noticed he was looking back into the aspens. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at, but then I noticed a splash of color that was completely out of place inside those thick trees. A small one-man tent was set back into the trees, about 50 feet from that strange table. I had an initial fear of dread and felt certain that there was someone inside that tent, and if we could see the tent, they could see us. There were no campgrounds in this area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely someone camping so remotely would be at the very least a strange person. However, as we observed the tent, we saw no movement, nor heard any sounds coming from it. Nick suggested I call out, but I didn't want to, so I did anyway. "Hey, anyone in there?" No reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about driving away and just leaving this strange area. But we began to fear for the worst. What if there was a body in that tent? What if someone had gotten kidnapped? Foolish, I know, but we thought it all the same. After a little debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the camp. Should we need to leave in a hurry, he would be waiting behind the wheel. With my heart pounding, I started walking through the trees toward that tent. I was totally keyed up with my senses on full alert. When I reached the campsite, several things struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered all over. No fire had been built. No wood collected. The tent was literally full of backpacks and women's clothing. Full of dread, I turned to leave and tell Nick what I'd seen. As I left, I heard Nick yelling, let's go, let's get out of here." Not knowing why he was yelling, I ran back to the truck. When I broke out of the trees, I saw a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately leapt into the passenger seat and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by two men. A third person was laying against the window in the back. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us from the road, but Nick drove around them and accelerated the way we'd come from. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road. Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified that they would catch up, we hit the highway without seeing the car again. I still do not know if the person in the back was a male or a female. I called the state police, They promised to send a trooper out to check the scene. However, I received a call the next day from a trooper, stating that the campsite, the backpacks, and the clothing was all gone, though he could tell people had been in that area. The strange table was still by the thick aspen grove. I have not returned to that area, and I never intend to again.
This took place in October of 2012 when I was 16 years old. For context, I'm a female. I stand 5 foot and am certainly petite. I mention this as this will be important in the story later on. I had gone to visit my grandparents that lived in this really cute cottage in a small town of North Carolina. The name of the town won't be mentioned as I don't want this incident spreading around that town. If I could remember correctly, it was a Friday night and my grandparents had gone out shopping for Halloween decorations. While they never celebrated Halloween, they did enjoy the vibe of it and would commonly give out candy to trick-or-treaters. For some reason, I didn't want to go with them and told them I'd stay here to play on my DS. Back then, the DS was one of the best toys of the year and everyone and their grandma had one. So they leave and I have the house to myself and try to make the best of it as I'm almost never home alone. At around 8 p.m., I'm playing on my DS as usual when I get a knock at the door. Assuming it was probably my grandparents back from their errands, I rushed to the door and opened it, but instead saw some guy. He looked normal, although a bit nervous, and asked me if my parents were home and that he was here to fix the water heater. I stupidly said that I was alone, and he gives me this wicked smile that sent chills down my spine. I then tell him that he could come back when they were here, and he then puts his foot in the door saying that he could just do it now. At this point, I was clearly uncomfortable, and I'm pretty sure he noticed that I was. Being only 16, I knew what was happening, but I couldn't resist him even if I tried. Like I said, I'm petite, so I wasn't just gonna push him away. However, the more I tried to resist him, the more angry he got, as he wasn't taking no for an answer. Now, I'm not one to be rude, but I was intimidated by him, as not only did he appear to be angry, but he was also huge. Not knowing what to do, I was about to run inside the house, but that's when I see a car pull in. It was my grandparents, and my grandpa immediately took notice as to what was going on. He steps out of the car and yells at the man to leave or he won't hesitate to blow his brains out. I see this man bolt away from the house down the road, disappearing into the night. After that, I remember them calling the sheriff, but I'm not sure if he ever got caught. The crime rate was very low in this town, so for something like this to happen was extremely rare. I thank my grandparents for arriving when they did. If they had arrived even a minute later, God only knows if I'd even be writing this or not.